We are in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. And for those visiting with us this morning, I'll take the next 45 minutes and give you Romans chapter 1 through 11. But then it wouldn't leave us any time to talk about Romans chapter 12. So just let me give you the fast version. Basically, Paul has been trying to help those in Rome to appreciate that both Jew and Gentile are now embraced by Jesus. And there are troubles and problems on the Jewish side of that equation. There are problems and challenges on the Gentile side of that equation. And he's now kind of reached a point in his approach towards this letter where he's going to give them some encouragement and some education as to about how it is those two entities that have been such at enmity with each other for so long, who have been so challenged in their relationship for so long, can now actually come together and function as a local body of believers there in Rome. And so when you come to Romans chapter 12, what we have happening is he begins to list some characteristics and qualities that will allow for them to appreciate the kind of people they should be in order to help them in their relationship one to another. So we're going to pick up in our study as he's been listing these things. We just finished talking about on Wednesday night the idea of being given to hospitality and the importance of being hospitable to one another. And so let's jump back into our study here in Romans chapter 12 and in verse 14. So he makes this statement here in this moment where he says, to do what about those who persecute you? Bless you. Quick question, no show of hands, no nods, no reactions, because it may prove to be too honest for us. How often have we done that? Let me ask it this way. When was the last time that you asked the Lord to bless those who brought harm or challenge or difficulty or hurt towards you? When was the last time I did that? You know, it's interesting. We read a narrative like this, right? And we can kind of see why Paul would say something like this. We can kind of see why he would encourage us in this way. But it's one thing to appreciate the narrative. It's a whole other thing to appreciate the implications and the applications of a thought like this. The next time I'm reviled, the next time I'm challenged, the next time somebody wants to argue with me, the next time somebody wants to specifically challenge who I am as a believer, the next time somebody wants to bring some issue up as it relates to why it is I'm a follower of Jesus, how am I going to respond to that? And do I revile back? Do I challenge back? Do I create more tumult and more difficulty? Or do I say a silent prayer, Lord, bless them, encourage them, help them, bless, and what's the alternative? He says, and curse not. The natural reaction when somebody's hurting you, harming you, saying something negative about you is to respond in kind, right? Our response typically among human beings is to respond in kind. And so, and I don't mean by being kind, I mean in the manner in which they've treated me. And so Paul challenges them. When you're persecuted, when you're hurt, bless, don't curse. Don't create challenge. And that's going to be necessary, right? Because this friction between Jew and Gentile is going to be very difficult for them to try to reconcile. And if they're playing this tick-for-tack kind of game, right? If they're playing this idea of every time the Gentile says something that upsets the Jew, and so I'm going to strike back at him, and then in the reverse happens, they're never going to have much peace there in the church at Rome. Somebody's got to step above it, right? And it might as well be me. Somebody's got to step above all that. Somebody's got to be the one that says, I will bless rather than curse. I will act kindly rather than create greater harm. Somebody's got to be the one. And it might as well be me. And I believe that's the challenge that Paul sets before us in that moment. He then says in verse 15, rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. I think Paul recognizes that there is a greater connection between the believers than sometimes we recognize. There is a bond. The family of God, the people of God, we don't just go to church together. Can I use that phrase? You understand what I mean by that? We don't just come to an assembly together and sit down in a bunch of pews in this comfortable building and we're here for an hour, hour and a half or so, however long it is, and then we go on our merry way and we disconnect. We reconnect when we come to the building, we disconnect when we leave the building. That's not the way it works. He said, you're a family of believers. And when you add verse 16 here in a moment, you'll even see it more clearly. But he says, so we're tied in when one of us rejoices, we all rejoice. When one of us is hurting, we're all hurting. Because that's the bond. And for me, in some ways, if I fail to rejoice when others are excited and happy and have something to celebrate, or I refuse or feel no idea or thought towards weeping with those who are hurting, that's a bond issue. That's a relationship issue. That's not just me being out of that's an indication that I have not connected as well as I should with those who are part of the body of believers. Paul doesn't want them just to tolerate, okay? Paul doesn't want them to just tolerate Jew and Gentile relationship, and that's the narrative still. He doesn't want them to just put up with each other, right? He wants them to go beyond that. He wants them to go beyond just the concept of, well, we're trying here. But to really unite in such a way and bond themselves in such a way that they have this great relationship. That when one is rejoicing, they're all rejoicing. When one is hurting and weeping, they're all hurting and weeping. That's the bond that's built. And then a greater challenge, verse 16. Be what? Same mind. Be the same mind. Wow. Quick show of hands. Chocolate ice cream, right hand. Vanilla ice cream, left hand. Right? And some of you went like this. Here's my point. We can't even agree on ice cream. It's hard. Right? And when we can't, it's hard on simple matters. Now extrapolate that into serious matters, spiritual matters, matters that involve the local body, matters that involve my relationship with Christ, matters that involve how it is that I work in harmony with my brothers and sisters in Christ. Motivate or move that line of significance way out here further than ice cream, right? And Paul challenges us, even in that matter, be of the same mind one toward another. But he helps us understand how we do that. Notice that he adds what? Mind not high things, but condescend. That word generally is a negative connotation to us. But the idea of condescend there isn't thumb your nose at somebody. That's kind of the way we think of that word. He's not talking about the idea that feel superior to somebody, so you're going to have to condescend. It's more of the idea of recognizing that I can yield. I can yield to others in order to strengthen the bond. I don't always have to be the one whose voice is heard. My opinion doesn't always have to come to the top. That I can yield and be willing to yield even to men of low estate. Be not wise in what? Your own conceit. Is it possible to get too smart? It sounds like that's an impossibility, but it's true. We can. If our knowledge puffs us up to where we can't yield to others. If our idea feels like that we've created a circumstance where we're superior. Our knowledge is superior. Our opinions are superior. Everything about what we consider is important is superior to what others think is important. And I've lost the ability to yield and condescend towards others. Then that's where the challenge comes. Go ahead, Bob.
This is not referring strictly to Christians of the same mind. Like the NIV uses the terminology to live in harmony with each other, which would take in the non-Christian too. That you've got to try to live. They're not going to be in the same mind with everybody. But if you're talking about Christians to be of the same mind, you could say the same mind as far as the spiritual life goes. And this is what I was concerning myself. Is this referring strictly to the Christians, or is this concerning everybody?
Well, I mean, the application could be broader, but to me, his conversation has been how they're dealing with one another. He'll change that in verse 18. He'll explore outside of the Christian relationship and challenge them to live peaceably with all men. I mean, I get it that there could be some general application of that thought, of this idea of being willing to yield and to not be so high-minded that we can't ever let somebody else's thoughts be superior. So maybe there's some generic there. My mind was just that he's dealing with the Christians in that moment, but I wouldn't argue that. Go ahead.
All men came from God, which is why he even says later on, do good to your enemies.
Yeah.
And should all live in harmony.
Yeah. So I think there definitely a general application can be made, especially when you add verse 18 to the context.
Well, excuse these Christians too smart for their own good.
And that's a possibility, right? We can, and especially when it makes us feel like we're better than others, and that's the challenge is to be knowledgeable in the will of God's important. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. That's Romans 10:17. So there's an importance that we should place on having an understanding of the will of God, but we can't let it make us feel like that we're better or superior to others because of that.
They use the phrase, it's either my way or no way.
Yeah. Especially in matters of opinion. So be careful. Don't become wise in our own conceits. Don't treat others as inferior to us. And then he challenges them in verse 17. Recompense what? Recompense to no man evil for evil. Again, a simple question. Is that easy to resist, the temptation to respond to evil with evil? And the answer is, yeah, it's hard, right? When people are acting in evil ways towards me, the tendency of most people is to respond in the same fashion. And so he challenges me. Don't recompense to any man evil for evil, but do what? Provide things honest in the sight of all men, right? Provide things honest in the sight of everybody. If somebody does a dishonest act towards me, that does not approve my dishonesty in return to them. If somebody doesn't treat me with respect or mistreats me in some fashion, doesn't excuse my dishonest behaviors in return to them. Our obligation in all matters to every man, back to the more generic principle under discussion, that no one should be returning evil for evil. And the idea of providing things that are honest in the sight of all men is important. Culturally, we have challenges, right? Because let me give you what my thought as concerning where we are culturally right now. Because here's what I see a lot of. My hypocrisy is not as bad as your hypocrisy because I'm smarter than you. And that's kind of where we're at. Just look at any discussion, pick an issue, and lay both sides beside each other, and you'll find that that's what happens. People will act in ways that they would disapprove of in others. They'll say, well, that fella is not worthy of his thought or position because he name calls. And then they call him a name when they do that. And vice versa, right? My hypocrisy isn't as bad as your hypocrisy because my issue is more important than yours. Or my thoughts are superior to yours. That's what he's challenging us to get rid of. You cannot, even if evil is real, even if what's being done to you is not right, and it's not good, and it's not just, even when evil is what's being offered to me, my obligation is to not return it evil for evil. My obligation in the sight of all men is to still be honest in the midst of that. And to still treat every circumstance, regardless of whether it's spiritual, political, social, neighbor to neighbor, co-worker to co-worker, classmate to classmate, whatever the relationship is, or whatever the connection or the moment is, evil for evil has never been approved of in the eyes of God. And so I have to be careful that I provide all things honest before all men. All things honest before all men, no matter what the issues in front of me. That's not always easy because all of us have buttons, right? And the people around us know how to push those buttons. And they push that button in there, and the temperature rises and the temper flares and we get all excited and we respond. And now don't all look at me like I'm the only one that does that. I'm feeling guilty. But we're all there, right? And so provide all things on. That's a challenge. It's a challenge. Go ahead. Sorry.
When we do that evil to evil, that we lose our influence with others. They see what how we retaliate.
Yeah.
They don't want it.
Jim, I think we lose credibility when we argue against a character or a. I don't mean that in terms of a person. I just mean when we argue and say that kind of behavior is inappropriate in that guy or in that world, but we're accepting of it over here, we lose credibility. And that's something that for the cause of Christ, credibility is an important aspect. We'll talk about it a lot. But if people don't view us as credible, our message gets blurred. And our effectiveness gets blurred. And so Paul challenges us here. Don't become like the world. That's the early part of Romans chapter 12, right? Do not be what to the world? Do not be conformed to the world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's how this whole conversation got started at the beginning of this chapter. And so he challenges us. Don't be conformed to this world. Be different than the world. Be transformed from it. The world's going to be hypocritical in its approach towards one another. The world's going to trade evil for evil, blow for blow. You be honest in the midst of that. And that's the challenge that he sets before us.
The perception of providing things honest. It's not a materialistic concept here. I think it's referring strictly to how you present yourself. In other words, you're presenting yourself as a Christian. You're presenting yourself as a light as far as the church goes to other people.
Yeah.
I think, isn't that what this is?
It's a character issue. It's not a single act issue. It's a character issue that he's driving at. Yep.
I was just looking up the word honest real quick. And I think a great definition of what he was talking about is Luke 8:15. When Jesus is talking. But that on the good ground are they which in honest and good heart, having heard the word, keep it, and bring forth fruit with patience. Yeah. And I think that defines the whole thing.
Yeah. That's the honest heart in its relationship to the gospel and its relationship to other issues as well. In line with that thought, then, he says, verse 18, if it be possible, and that possibility is qualified by this statement, by the way, as much as what? As lieth in you, okay? You can't control both sides of an argument, right? You can't control the other side of an argument. Who's the only person you can control in that environment? Me, right? It's me. And so the command is, or the instruction is, if it be possible, qualifier, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Is it possible that somebody's just determined to not be peaceable with you? Yeah. It's absolutely possible. It's absolutely possible that somebody is absolutely determined that it didn't matter, it wouldn't matter what you did, what you said, how you changed, how you represented certain things. There are some who are determined to not live peaceably with you. But the question isn't whether I act in certain ways only or solely if the other person cooperates with me. The challenge Paul sets before us is as much as is within me, as much as lies within my abilities and my power and the things and decisions and choices that I am making, be peaceable. I'd like to think that all of us like to have some levels of peace around us. And sometimes there's going to be some moments where I'm the sole source of that peace. That if I don't choose peace in the moment of conflict, if I don't choose a peaceable approach towards a situation and a challenge that I might find myself in, then who will? And throwing fire towards fire only makes more fire. Only makes more fire. Only creates great. Have a lack of peace or to refuse to get along with one another. I can follow the pattern of others in that same pursuit, but it only complicates the situation. My obligation is to be peaceable, and again, that's generic with all men, with everybody that I encounter, not just those who it's easy to be peaceable with. If that were the case, we could handle that, right? If Paul challenged us to just be peaceable with those who are also peaceable with us, then problem solved. We can do that. But he's saying be peaceable even when others are not. And when they create harm and challenge and difficulty. Remember that in the broader scope of the letter. We've tried to remind folks once in a while in our study that really all the epistles should be understood in their entirety, because sometimes if we shrink it down too far, we'll lose really the meaning that the writer's trying to drive at, because we've shrunk it to a small snippet, and we don't understand that snippet within the greater form. And so Paul's writing this letter, and eventually he's going to have this conversation in Romans chapter 14 about how they deal with one another when one wants to kind of keep some of those Jewish holidays and others don't, and how do we live peaceably with one another in those moments. So there's going to be some very practical ways that Paul's going to address in the rest of this letter, where they're going to have to find a way. They're going to have to find a way to live peaceably with each other.
Well, the verse indicates it's not possible always to do this.
Yeah.
It's something that can't be accomplished. Yet, you still got to try. Whether to live peaceably, you might want to avoid it.
Yeah.
But when you have the present day situations where different people are creating problems for you to worship your God, then you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
You have to stand up.
Yeah. And we can defend and do what is right in peaceable ways. And that's the challenge sometimes that's set before us, is to when it is a matter of doing what's right and standing firm in truth and what the will of God would be, to even as much as within me is, to find a peaceable way to do that even when there's conflict.
How do we do it? Just people constantly, you gotta watch. They'll start influencing you.
Yeah. Jim, let me share something with you, and just food for thought through a biblical example. If you recall, during the first journey Paul and Barnabas took, there was a fellow went with them that abandoned them along the way. Who was that? You may remember who that was. It was John Mark, right? And so they determined they're going to take a second trip, right? And so they're discussing who we're going to take with us. And Barnabas wanted to take who? John Mark. He wanted to give him another opportunity. He felt that those issues apparently, and we don't have all the details of that, but Barnabas stands up and says, what did Paul say about that? I'm not sure about that, right? Paul says, I don't think. And what did Paul and Barnabas do? Did they go away mad? No, they just determined a peaceable solution. And the peaceable solution was, we're not going to come to full agreement about whether John Mark should go with us. So let's do more good by you take him and anybody else, and you go this direction. I'll take others, and we'll go this direction, and we'll go fulfill the purposes and work. Sometimes, Bob, or Jim, rather, you were the one who asked the question. Sometimes the answer may lie in the fact that I may have to distance myself. If that strife and that harm can't seem to be resolved in that moment, then it may take a period of time where I have to disconnect for a while. But remember, though, even in that moment when Paul and Barnabas decided that was the solution in that moment, we see them reconnect later. They didn't live forever that way. You see them get past the tumult of the moment by saying, okay, let's just agree to go different directions and do the work. But you find them in harmony with one another again later. And so sometimes it may be when somebody is just determined, then sometimes some distance can help maybe let whatever that issue or that problem is kind of simmer down. And then come back and reconnect later to try to be more peaceable with one another.
They can see that we're not going to get into it.
Yeah, I think that at some point you got to be willing to say, okay, this isn't working. And so long as we're arguing over this, there's no peace for anybody. And it may be best that we just...
one time Paul said that told the Jews that you won't accept the gospel, so we're going to just leave you.
Yeah.
And that's, you're on the road.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Verse 19. So then he says, Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will pay, saith the Lord. And so you've got various facets here of conversation happening. You've got this argument of making sure that you live peaceably with all men, deal honestly with all men. That's the kind of the theme that he's been approaching here in the last couple of verses. And then he reminds them that, in my estimation, that part of conflict and part of having trouble being peaceable with one another is created when we're continually trying to seek out our own retribution for every evil and every act of injustice that we deem has occurred around us. Sometimes it's better to just say, who'll handle that? Let God handle it, right? Let the Lord handle it. It's only creating a lack of peace in my life because I'm continually trying to right every wrong, and I'm continually trying to force justice in circumstances, and I'm trying to force what's right in every circumstance, and all it ends up doing is drive me what? Crazy. All it does is rob me of the joy and the peace that God really wants for me. All it does is make me miserable. And so God says, listen, don't avenge yourselves. Don't feel like that you've got to take every evil and every wrong that's ever happened and take a personal approach toward resolving or avenging that. But number one, he says, give place unto wrath. I read one writer said that he surmised that maybe that's the idea of let the legal process take place. Let the law take care of it. Let things that God has set in place to deal with injustices, give it an opportunity. Let the process take its place. Be that as it may, my contention has always been more of the idea that this thought is let God deal with this. He's the one that ultimately can address all wrongs and all harms and all hurts. And so there's a tremendous judgment that is to come at the hands of God. There's a moment, we'll talk a little bit about the sermon this morning, but there's an ultimate judgment coming at the hands of God. And so don't feel like, well, they're getting away with something, right? How many of us have ever said that, right? We feel like somebody's getting away with it. I don't want them to get away with it. Sometimes we've got to say, the Lord will repay that. The Lord will address that at some point. Even if it takes to the second coming of Christ and the ultimate judgment that comes down against all men, sometimes I got to leave that mindset of somebody's getting away with something. And I've got to and let that rest in the hands of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine. God says, I will repay, saith the Lord. And so the next time we feel that urge to try to right a wrong that maybe has never been righted for a long, long time, or we see something that rather than seeking our personal vengeance, let the Lord care for it. So what should our response be? If we're not seeking vengeance, what are we doing? Verse 20. Yeah. Doing the exact opposite. For if thine enemy hunger, Feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Our personal vengeance may want to just jump straight to the what? Jump straight to the coals of fire. That sounds more like what we want, right? Can I just jump straight to the coals of fire part? Let me just dump the coals on it. That's what we want to do sometimes when we're seeking personal vengeance. So what God's wisdom here through Paul says is, if you really want to heap coals of fire, don't literally do it. Do the exact opposite of what they're expecting. They're expecting you to heap coals of fire. They're expecting you to strike out against them. They're expecting you to try to seek some personal retribution or vengeance towards this circumstance. So create a sense of guilt in them. Create a sense, for lack of a better word, shame in them. Create a moment where they actually have to think soberly about what they have done because they've mistreated you and you've given them kindness and consideration and you've fed them when they were hungry. You've given them to drink when they're thirsty. You've responded in ways that are not consistent with how most people react. And here's the key to this. We can't say to ourselves, well, that won't work. Because that hinders the process, right? Sometimes we predetermine, or we have to resist the temptation of saying, well, I tried that. I fed them once. Sure, it was a microwave hot dog, right? On a stale bun. But I fed them. You get what I mean? We offer to appease our conscience. We're not really trying to fulfill what Paul said here. We're really not trying to do the opposite of what I want. We're trying to appease our conscience. Oh, I didn't strike back. Stale bread was offered and lukewarm cup of water from the tap here in Page City. Sorry. That's the way we are sometimes. And we're not really trying to fulfill what God's really trying to encourage us to do. What we're doing is we're trying to appease our own consciences, and that's not going to work. He says, feed them. Don't do the exact opposite of what they're expecting you to do. Don't mistreat. Don't render evil for evil. Don't seek your own vengeance. Don't be disagreeable because they're disagreeable. I think in many ways this is kind of a summation of what he's already been saying in all these prior verses. Avoid that kind of thing. And that's how you're going to heap coals of fire. That's how you hope to be able to get them to recognize and see what they have been doing to you or how they've been treating you or the things that are associated with that. Because here's the challenge. Once you start down that road of evil, what happens according to verse 21? You're overcome by it. The next thing I know, what might have started out in my mind is seeking justice. What might have started out in my mind is bringing retribution and vengeance against a wrong that deserves to be made known and addressed. And what started out as maybe a motive or an intent with a good purpose behind it, but because I chose dishonesty in my approach, because I was hypocritical in my approach, because I wasn't striving to be peaceable in my approach, because I would rather take from them rather than give to them. Now, the next thing I know, I'm overcoming evil, and that doesn't help either one of us. If I become overcome by evil in the process, number one, that doesn't help them correct their issue. And number two, now I'm just what? I'm just like them. I'm just like them. I'm in the same boat. So Paul's giving some tremendous wisdom, obviously so when it comes from the mind of God. But here's tremendous wisdom. Do not be overcome of evil, but overcome evil good. And that's not always easy. I'll come back to you, John. Go ahead, Jason.
Be holy for I am holy.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, you can maintain the peace. And we all probably know that's one of the first things Satan wants to try to take from you is your peace.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead.
By doing good, how do you know you might save a soul?
Yeah. You don't know what And here's the thing: if we don't even try the plan and purpose that God has outlined here through Paul, if we don't even make an attempt, then how do we know that it may not? And it may not. I think that's why Paul kind of gives a disclaimer there when he says, if it's possible, and as much as within you is, live peaceably. He recognizes that it might not have the desired effect on others, but it's better than being overcome with evil. It leaves me in a right relationship with God. And given an opportunity, you don't know who you might turn away from their evil thoughts and purposes. And in a circumstance, you might even diffuse arguments and challenges by doing something completely out of the ordinary in some senses as it relates to those challenges.
All men being from God, I can't remember the exact scripture, but like Jesus said something about, well, you clothed me and you fed me and so forth and so on, and then those who didn't, and all men are from God, we should treat everyone lovingly and accordingly.
Yeah.
Just out of respect for him, if you don't respect him. You should still love them, though, right? Yeah.
There is an importance of us. As we give respect and honor to men, we're giving respect and honor to the God who created us. And that's an important quality for us to demonstrate unto others. Go ahead, Randy.
I saw this number 4 leave us an example that we can follow in steps. 1 Peter 2:21. And it seems to me that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah. There's definitely a sense here that we're getting a description of exactly how Jesus conducted himself, and how he would desire his followers to conduct themselves. And he has given us the example of that. I mean, how many times could we go into the narrative and recognize moments where Jesus did exactly this approach? When you see him wash the feet of his disciples, step one, the willingness to serve. But then he also, in that moment, washes the feet of Judas, who's going to leave that scene and head over to the chief priests and elders and offer Jesus up and betray him. And Jesus knows that. And yet here he is, not wanting to harm Judas, but treating him and heaping coals of fire. And I think that is really, in many ways, you think of a great application of that. What Judas has already predetermined what he's going to do. And he's already had that moment where all the disciples come and say, Lord, is it I? Am I the one that's going to be the betrayer? And then Jesus washes the disciples' feet. You talk about heaping coals of fire. Can you imagine being Judas sitting there and having your feet washed by the very one you're about to go and betray? But you're right, Randy. These qualities and characteristics that are being described here are exactly the nature and character of who the Savior was.
A lot of people who feel injustice has been done. And I think you see this a lot in the school systems, which we're seeing today, is the fact they're wanting to see justice done, and it's not happening.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, it might take to the end of time for that justice to happen. So you might not see it in this lifetime, but it's something that's hard. Just like the movie, they have one out. I think they just did a remake on Death Wish, where everything's taken in, takes it out of the law, and do where it himself. You want to see justice done, right? Man, what happens?
And here's the challenge with that: there will never be perfect justice when human beings are the arbitrators of it. And that's just the truth. It'll never be. That's why he says, don't seek your own personal vengeance. Leave it to the Lord, because he's the only one who can perfectly address this. When human beings are the arbitrators of justice, they're going to make mistakes. They're going to charge the wrong person at times. They're not going to give the amount of justice that was deserved in certain moments. It's going to be flawed because human beings are the arbitrators.
And Judges says, and the reckoning table is right in his own.
Yeah.
That's what's going to go to.
And that's been man's demise for a long time. When men choose the standard of righteousness based on their own mindset. All right, Lord willing, then on Wednesday we'll come back into our study and we'll jump into chapter 13, verse 1. By the way, I should have mentioned this to you.